Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone who is here for the first in a series of webinars that JHR's Indigenous Reporters program will be hosting over the next few months. This one is called Journeys into Journalism, and we will have 4 emerging Indigenous journalists discussing what really does that mean to be an emerging Indigenous journalist in this climate? How did they get where they are? What did that take? How's the industry supported their careers, and what more could be happening to support Indigenous journalists like them? So hello to whoever just messaged and said hello in the chat to me. Myself and Bill Killorn, who's JHR's Deputy Director, will be moderating chats, so please do send us any questions that you have as we're running along and as the panelists are chatting, and we'll pass your questions on to them. Also, there will be a survey popping up on your screen in front of you as you're watching, and that's just us trying to collect a little bit of information about who is attending our events and what kind of audience we are reaching with these, and we'd really appreciate it if you could answer those questions. It helps us in our planning going forward. Whoever just said that to us. So it's great to see so many people showing up to hear these lovely panelists. And you're not here to see me, so I'm going to pass it over to Brittany Hobson, Shelby Lisk, Oscar Baker III, and Jolene Banning, our 4 wonderful panelists who are going to keep you all engaged and informed over the next half hour. So over to them. And thanks for being here, and thanks to our panelists as well for joining us today. Hi, Brittany.
Hi, bonjour, Anine. My name is Brittany Hobson, and I unfortunately don't know how to introduce myself in my language. That's something I'm working on, but I'm glad to be here. I'm the moderator for this event, and I'm a reporter with APT on the Aboriginal People's Television Network. I'm based in Winnipeg, our headquarters, and I've been there for 4 years now, and like I said, I'm happy to be here and happy to speak with these other emerging journalists, and you guys can kind of hopefully take something away from this. So I will throw it over to them to introduce themselves. Maybe we can start with Oscar.
Nina Dalusi, Oscar Baker III. Mi'kmaq and Black from Elsipogtog First Nation, and I've been working in the field for about 7 years now. I now have been working the Indigenous Affairs beat at the Cape Breton Post for since March, and yeah, looking forward to having this conversation.
Thank you, and we'll head over to Shelby.
There you go. I'm Shelby Lisk. I'm from Gundege or Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory in Ontario. I work for TVO as their Indigenous Hub reporter. So I mostly write current affairs for TVO.org, but I also come from a visual and photography background. So I try to get that into my work as much as I can. And I'm also a filmmaker as well. So I do many things, too many things. And I live in Ottawa. I should also say, and I work out of Carleton's journalism department when everything's not closed down. So as a part of a partnership with TVO, I work with Carleton's journalism program and get to engage with some of their students, which is really cool as well. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
And last but not least, we have Jolene.
Hi, I'm Jolene Banning from Fort William First Nation. I am living and working from my home territory. I think I probably jumped into journalism full steam probably just a little over 2 years ago, although one of my first jobs out of college was with a major media source. I didn't really jump into journalism until a couple of years ago. And I'm great. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you much. I think we're going to start. We kind of discussed it a little bit, but just maybe about how we kind of all got here, maybe our journey to journalism, as this webinar is so aptly called. I can start. Like I had mentioned, I've been with APTN for 4 years. This actually was pretty much my first job in the industry. Before that, I was a student. A lifelong student, it felt like. But I did have some stints in at one of our local newspapers here in Winnipeg and at CBC Manitoba. But I ended up at APTN right after I graduated from J school, and I started there on a 3-month internship. And essentially, there was some staff change and some movement, and a position opened up, and I applied for it and got it, and I've been there ever since. But I didn't necessarily want to go into Indigenous journalism per se when I started out. I was born and raised in Winnipeg, but from Treaty 1 First Nation, Long Plain First Nation. It's about an hour and a half west of the city, but I did not grow up there, nor did I have much connection to my culture. So I was very disconnected, or an urban Indigenous person, as you may say. So I think that part of me felt when I went into journalism that maybe I wasn't coming from it from a good point of view, not knowing my culture and not knowing maybe some of the issues that were going on as well as I should have. But one of my instructors in J school really encouraged me to try this out just to see how I would like it. And I found that the issues that I felt most important for me to report on, such as issues surrounding women and children, I could report on a lot in the position that I'm in now. And so I have really been enjoying it, and I have found that it also has been a way for me to connect to my culture in a way that I haven't really experienced before. So I will, that's kind of the long and short of it. Maybe we'll go to Oscar next. If you could tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, for sure. My journey into journalism, I've always enjoyed writing. It's always been a passion of mine. I also coupled with that, like talking and meeting new people. But I got my first start at my reserves local newspaper back in 2013 at the Elsbukdagaway, just covering community events, doing some streeters, talking to people about what the community's monthly calendar event meant to them, whether that was like Father's Day or the TRC monolith unveiling. Then I was already in university at the time, so I became part of the journalism department at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Started writing for the local the student newspaper, the Equinian. And then through JHR, I got a internship with Global News in Halifax in 2015. From there, I did some internships with the CBC. Also worked at the Walrus magazine, the Deep magazine, and right now, like I said before, I'm currently taking on the role as the Indigenous Affairs reporter. But a lot of my job here is kind of repairing the rapport between the communities in Unama'ki. There are 5 Mi'kmaq communities, Weguma, Wamakuk, Membertou, Eskazoni, and Budladek. But so many of the community members that I help cover have had such a bad relationship with the local newspaper. So a lot of my time is using, like you mentioned, parts of my culture to help and gain that trust again. It's a rarity for me not to go out with at least some tobacco ties, just to sit with people, to talk with them and let them know that, yes, I'm a reporter, but I'm here to cover the community in a much larger scope. Unfortunately, because of the ruralness of most communities, the only time they really see media drop in is when tragedies strike, which is a common occurrence for a lot of Indigenous communities. But it's commonplace for me just to go and park at the local coffee shop in one of the communities and just sit and talk to people, let them know that I'm not some big scary journalist there to make them look dumb, that I understand that not everybody in the community is English first. And if that's the case, then I note that in my copy. Unfortunately, I'm not fully fluent in Mi'kmaq, but in some of my newspaper articles, I'll say this interview was conducted in English because they're Mi'kmaq first. And like many of you would know, sometimes there's just not an English translation for some Indigenous words. So asking questions in English, some things just might get lost in translation. But yeah, that's really where I'm at today, and just kind of learning the ways of daily news. Most organizations that I've worked for before were more longer form in nature, or they kind of understood that working in Indigenous beat was kind of a specialty. But today is like, okay, I have daily deadlines to meet, and that's been an adjustment for me. People who cover community, you understand that people kind of run at a different time. Colloquially, we call it Indian time. People just kind of they take their time, but they don't always understand that media is such a churning out just content and copy. So a bit of that is trying to get my editors to understand that, but also to gain the trust of community members so they're quicker to answer me and know that my role is there as a Mi'kmaq journalist too. Yeah, but that's where I'm at. Thank you.
So you've touched on a few different things that we will circle back to throughout this conversation. Next, I'm going to go to Shelby now. How did you get your start? As you had mentioned, you're an artist.
Yeah, so I'm a little baby journalist, I think, in comparison to everyone here. I only graduated in 2019 from J School, but I did my undergrad degree in visual arts. So I come from that visual background. And after I graduated university in 2015, I sort of, I think like a lot of people, I traveled around and I didn't know really what to do with it. And I started seeing all of these really amazing documentary photographers, like especially female photojournalists. And it really opened my mind. I think that growing up in sort of a small town, my idea of journalism was like, you go cover the local basketball game or, whatever it is. Not that there's anything wrong with that at all, but it sort of just like opened my mind to all these possibilities that, journalism can be really creative, that it can be, you can do these like more long-term invested stories. And so I just happened to be living in my hometown, which has one of the only photojournalism programs in Canada. So I thought, okay, this must mean something. Here I go. So I went and did that. And then after I graduated in 2019, I did an internship with a video production company that's run by Anne-Marie Jackson, who used to work for the Toronto Star and the Globe and sort of went out on her own. So I got to work on a lot of video projects with her, like edit some documentaries, but also some more journalistic pieces. And then I did a short internship at the Globe on their photo desk, which was really cool. Getting to see how a very large organization works. And then after that, I did an internship with APTN's Ottawa Bureau that I got through JHR. And I was only there, it was supposed to be a 3-month internship. I was there for 2 weeks, and then I got offered the job at TVO. So both JHR and APTN were very supportive of me, saying like, no, go, go take this job, go take this opportunity. So I didn't get to stay at APTN for as long as I would have liked to, but it was still a really great opportunity to get a little bit of a taste of all of these different places. And now I've been at TVO for about a year.
I remember when you were at APTN, and it seemed like in a blink of an eye, and we didn't really get to, even though you're in Ottawa, obviously wouldn't have gotten to meet you, but really glad to see you land at TVO. and I guess kind of officially meet you face to face now.
Yeah, everyone at APTN was so nice. I had everyone reaching out to me, like adding me on Facebook, being like, welcome, welcome. And then I was like, I'm gone, but nice to meet you. Yeah.
But I mean, that's kind of the beauty of these internships. And then it's nice to see where people can land afterwards. And I think that is a good segue to go into Jolene. Jolene, you've, I won't speak for you, but you're got your hand in a couple different pies right now. And you did mention that you've only recently got into journalism. I guess if you can explain a little bit more about that. Oh, you're muted.
Oops, sorry about that. Sure. So when I graduated from college many years back, an internship opened up at the local radio station here in Thunder Bay. So I immediately applied for it. It was a 2-year internship, and it was to cover the regional weather and the arts reporting with an opportunity to spend 10 weeks in the newsroom. So I was very excited to do that. The manager said I had a great voice for radio, and we started making plans for me to have a radio column. And after my 10 weeks in the newsroom, I would get some radio skills training, and all these plans were made for me. And then, plans fell apart, and it just didn't go anywhere. I stayed where I was. I ended up getting hired on as administration, and I had my morning show column or my weekly column, and the arts reports got canceled and the PSAs got canceled as, radio changes and such. But I kept my column for probably a little over a decade. And then because of the ever-growing changes in media, eventually I ended up getting cut. I was seen as one of those non-essential workers. So I got cut, and I tried looking for work in other places, and I just kept coming back to communication. It seemed like this was really where I kind of wanted to be. Like, I had a taste for storytelling, and I thought, this is what I want to do. So I just tried it. I just sent in a couple stories to Anishinaabe News, and then I heard about JHR from a previous coworker, and then it just happened that JHR was coming to my community, Fort William First Nation. So I jumped on board with JHR and immediately just started submitting to newspapers and other media organizations. And APTN took me in for an internship. And it's just been, that's how I basically got back into journalism, or got into journalism.
Thank you. For my next question, I'm going to just throw it out to you guys, because I mean, I am working in an Indigenous newsroom, so my experience is going to be very different for you guys who are not necessarily working in Indigenous newsrooms. But Oscar, and you touched a little bit already in the last question, but I guess if you could just talk a little bit about, as a First Nations journalist and a Black journalist, what it's like to work at the paper that you're working at, and especially like an Indigenous beat that's specific to that paper.
Yeah, I think I was surprised taking on this role at the lack of diversity in the newsroom. But I was always reminded through some of my mentors that when there are problems, sometimes that creates a opportunity for change. So largely, I've spent my time trying to educate those in the newsroom who want to learn more about Mi'kmaq communities, Mi'kmaq history, and some helpful hints at reporting in these communities. My background allows me to sympathize and kind of empathize with what it feels like to not always see people of your background represented kind of fairly in the newsroom. most in our communities here in Unama'ki would say that most of the coverage about it are police beats. Who's brought up in charges, what kind of crimes are committed. And, my background, I think, and I've wrote about it before, was just understanding that so many of the crimes that I've seen around me in my life were poverty driven. People weren't necessarily thieves because they wanted to enact in criminality, but because they were desperate and in survival mode. I've wrote about how colonization has affected both sides of my family, from my father and my mom. My mom is Mi'kmaq, and my father's Black from St. Augustine, Florida. But how that operates in the newsroom is just sometimes you have to remind people that you're not just talking about one person in that community, that when you're covering a crime or a crime beat, that affects everybody in the community because they know that person somehow. And it's the only largely non-Indigenous Canadians learn so much, or their information is so informed by the media that you have to do a better job of explaining why some of these things happen in community, but also know that you're the lens to which they see communities. Because people who have lived, because I'm based in Sydney, some people have lived in Sydney all their life, but have never gone to a First Nations community. And I don't think some of my other colleagues have even thought about that. But it's a challenge to journalists to understand that you might be the way people see the communities that you're reporting on and have just never gone there, which I don't know if I did a great job of answering your question, but I guess that's
I think that was great. I mean, I was nodding my head like the entire time, touching on so many great points. And I think that the sympathy and empathy one is a really good one. And that's something that I, try to reinforce just even in my everyday life, speaking with some of my non-Indigenous friends, that, like we should be looking at these things, with empathy and understanding about why some of these things are the way that they are. Shelby, you're kind of in the same boat there. You're in the Indigenous hub at TVO. So if you could, I guess, follow up and tell us a little bit about how it's like in that particular newsroom.
Yeah, I think that, when you were talking, Brittany, about your own journey, not growing up with your culture and sort of feeling like this imposter syndrome, like not knowing enough. I had a lot of that when I first started my position. I knew that I wanted to cover Indigenous stories. I knew that I love the communities and I wanted to make a difference. But when I got into the position, I was just so overwhelmed with like the responsibility of telling those stories and just feeling like, I don't know enough, like who am I to think that I could do this? And I felt a lot of pressure to not make any mistakes or let anyone down. And I think that we have a lot of weight on our shoulders of, we want to right all of these wrongs in media representation over the last hundreds of years. And so it is a lot of pressure, but it's very important. And so, I am I'm very happy that I get to just tell Indigenous stories, and but I'm also lucky that there's other journalists at TVO who are not Indigenous, but are also very sensitive and really connected to the communities that they cover as well, especially in Northern Ontario, because in my position, I'm the Indigenous hub, but I'm in Ottawa. I'm so far from so many communities, and especially right now, like with COVID, I can't really go anywhere. But before that, I was making plans to travel up to some communities to cover stories, because it's really hard to make relationships over the phone. They have no idea who I am, and it's hard to build that trust. And so, being one little person trying to cover all of Ontario is a bit tough. And I think also just realizing, like trying to give myself, I think, a little bit of like compassion and space to realize that, you know, these stories can really affect us. You know, we're really close to the issues. And so I remember having to go on TV and talk about like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, for instance. And I remember after, I'm sharing, this is very personal, but I like bawled my eyes out in my office. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm really new at this job. Like I must just be really stressed out. And then like months later, I was like, no, that was just like, it's really hard to do that. And even, you know, like this spring writing about, you know, the government's lack of action on, you know, the action plan for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And at the same time, you know, seeing on social media and like everywhere in the news, like all the Indigenous people and people of color that are just being killed daily. And I'm trying to like, you know, shoulder all of this, and everyone, you know, who's not a journalist is saying, you know, limit your social media right now because the world is a very sad and scary place. But we can't do that. We have to know what is going on. So I do find those things very challenging. But also I think, well, I think everyone on this call knows that those things are challenging, but there's obviously a reason why we continue to do this. So those are, and as a new journalist, you know, I'm still working through some of those things and kind of figuring out how to navigate that.
Again, I was nodding like the entire time that you were speaking. You touched on a lot of great points, and thank you for sharing. It's, I mean, I'm 4 years into this, but without much experience beforehand, and I'm feeling a lot of the same things that you were feeling. Definitely, like there is a huge responsibility, and there are often times that I feel that I have not lived up to that responsibility. But again, practicing that compassion, and you know, in Winnipeg, we focus a lot on Winnipeg, I think, because we have the largest urban Indigenous population. So there's so much going on here. But not all of it is great. And it is really hard to, like earlier, kind of right towards the pandemic in Winnipeg, there was 3 police involved. Police shot 3 Indigenous people within a 10-day span. And I have to report on that. I don't get a choice. I have to report on that. And I have been reporting on that for like 4 years. And there are journalists that have been reporting on that for far longer than I have. But there was a moment there where I kind of broke down a little bit too, and was like, I'm sick and tired of doing these stories and that this keeps happening. But we have to do these stories. We have to hold these institutions to account. So it is one of those things. And I did take the weekend of social media because I really needed to for my mental health. But yeah, we don't always get to remove ourselves because we are in these communities. We are a part of these communities. So Jolene, you're a little bit different because you kind of are doing a freelance. So you're not particularly in one newsroom, but you've worked with a number of different organizations. So I guess if you could maybe talk a little bit about your experience with these organizations.
Well, I think that for me, having sort of been there in a mainstream media and having just watched it and witnessed it and just seeing how they got it so wrong and just shouldering that pain, right? Of like seeing Indigenous female body parts on display, or, you know, hearing about MMIW being wrong, that the inquiry got it wrong, like listening to these media organizations still not accept or hear what we have to say. And so being an outsider looking into these media organizations, like it leaves me with not a lot of faith that they are going to tell our stories and tell our stories in a responsible, respectful way. And I think that sort of like leaves me a little bit shattered on how I feel about mainstream media. And it always leaves me with a little bit of lack of trust when it comes to mainstream media. And so as a freelancer, I always think, I know that we're more than just our trauma. And I try to focus my stories on more than just trauma and more than just, you know, our pain. I really focus, I try to focus hard on our stories of strength and resiliency, because mainstream media will always go for the stories that will give us clicks and baits and hits. And those are always our trauma stories. Those are always our stories of pain and struggling about what's happening on this poor underfunded reserve. Like, and it always sort of tends to almost tell it through their lens without giving the historical context of why. Like, why is this reserve so poor? Why does this reserve have no clean water? Why are there so many murdered and missing Indigenous women? You never hear that side of the story when it comes from mainstream media. And I don't mean to say lump all mainstream media into one category, because I know APTN is a major network, and they clearly don't do that. So I don't mean to lump all mainstream media into the same category, but that's just been my experience so far with major media, is that I feel like sometimes I don't see that understanding where Indigenous people are coming from. So I try to not focus, and I'm sort of almost losing trust in them.
I mean, you did mention APTN, and I would consider them, a major news network, not necessarily mainstream. But I would say, just to add on to that, is that, when I got into this industry and like coming from that urban Indigenous perspective where I really was disconnected, and I was getting watching these major news networks and watching the stories that they told about Indigenous people. So I feel a little ashamed to say this, but, I was getting that perspective, and that, it's all poverty and trauma, et cetera. And, kind of, trying to understand where I fit into all of this, because that's not necessarily what my experience was like growing up. So it wasn't really until APTN that I kind of got to see a different perspective of Indigenous storytelling, where, we are celebrating our culture, where we are, going to powwows and, going to feasts, and like Oscar said, bringing that tobacco and incorporating all of these practices into our storytelling. And really, for the first time, I got to see kind of Indigenous people's told in a positive, their stories told in a positive way or shared in a positive way. And then I also got to be a part of that. Some of my favorite stories actually are the ones about resilience and about our youth doing amazing things, and breaking those cycles, or whatever you want to call it. That's for me where I get the most satisfaction as a storyteller, and being able to share these stories. And I'm really thankful that APTN gives me the opportunity to do that.
Definitely. One of the things that I loved about APTN was their coverage of Idle No More. That was major groundbreaking news. And I was there at those rallies in Thunder Bay, because we had a few round dances on the highway, on the reserve, at the bridge, and there was no media there except APTN, and I'm grateful for that.
Thanks. I guess if we can go into our next question, I'm just taking a look here. What about, I guess, your different workplaces, this may be more specifically for Oscar and Shelby, are doing to support emerging Indigenous journalists? Oscar, we'll start with you.
Does that mean the current job that I have specifically, or?
Yeah, I would say the current job specifically, and then maybe if you've any other places that you've worked at that you thought you were doing a good job, or maybe needed a little work on.
Yeah, currently the Cape Breton Post is doing a much better job of hands-on skill training. I'm learning a lot as this role takes shape. But so many of the job opportunities that are appearing now require multimedia skills. Gone are the days of just web writing. most of my role is including like taking some video, photography, and other multimedia skills. And I appreciate getting to learn that from professionals. Other places that I've worked to are really stressing that, learning a lot of skills, even editing skills. I think industry wide, I've always enjoyed, I like the fact that more places are seeking out Indigenous or people of color specifically on their listings for people that they're looking for. Because I hope that more newsrooms encourage diversity. It's still a big struggle for most places to recruit people. I hear a lot from my own circle, that they feel underqualified for some of these roles. But hearing that they're looking for maybe somebody with connection to an Indigenous community would encourage somebody with to at least try to apply and take on that role. Sometimes there's a lot of self-doubt that can creep in when you start looking at all the different skills required. But when I guess personally for me, when you see that they're looking for a person of color or somebody with Indigenous connections, it's that extra level of like, okay, well, maybe I should go ahead and apply instead of talking myself out of not applying.
Thanks. I think that's at least with my own experience when I applied for the internship at APTN that was through JHR. I felt very underqualified for that, and it was really my journalism instructor that was like, well, if you don't really try, like, how do you know? And then when I went there, I found that it was, I did get some support, and particularly from a longtime journalist that had been there, and she kind of took me under her wing, and it was really nice. And she helped me hone my skills and kind of showed me that, yeah, I can do this. So it was really nice to hear. And I think that we need to have kind of some of those mentors in the newsroom that are really willing to sit and work with some of our younger journalists that are coming into the newsroom. Shelby, I guess, same question for you.
Sorry, I just unmuted myself because I knew I was going to be next, and then my doorbell rang. So I'm sorry if you guys all heard that. I was like, great timing. But the organization I work for, is not by any means is perfect, obviously. But I think that there is a lot of willingness and eagerness to learn from what I've noticed. But of course, I mean, like we'll all say, we can't spend all of our time teaching people or doing that work. But I think that especially I would say on like a one-on-one sort of level, not really like a structure level, but my editors, they will take the time to listen to me. And, if they make an edit that I am like, ew, like that is not a good idea, we have that back and forth. And I think they give me that space to have those conversations. And I think that I'm also lucky to have other Indigenous journalists at TVO. Like I know there's a lot of organizations where you might be the one lone Indigenous journalist or person of color in the organization. And I am really lucky to have an Indigenous colleague in Red Rock and also a video journalist who's Indigenous that works for us. And they have been so supportive. Like, I think that's how I make it through, when I'm having a bad day, or if I'm feeling like, oh, am I just being really sensitive about this? It's nice to have other people to be able to talk to about that. And I know that this is not journalism specific, but I worked for the federal government for a little while in Indigenous hiring strategies. And one of the things that we talked about in our research and was hiring Indigenous people in like a buddy system so that they don't feel isolated within these large organizations, and they have somebody else who they feel comfortable with and who they can relate to. And I think from my experience having those other Indigenous colleagues, I can see how immensely beneficial that is. I also think that Oscar mentioned this as well about learning. At TVO, learning is like their mandate, which is great because I love learning. So they do give us a lot of opportunities to take on learning. And we actually have to do a certain number of hours of learning every year, which is really nice. And so I was able to take, for instance, I took a 4-month podcasting course. And so that was a completely new skill that I'd learned that I'd never done before. And hopefully I might be able to integrate that into my job as well. And I think another thing that might sound actually really counterintuitive is that my editors have supported me to tell non-Indigenous stories. And that was something that I didn't really know I could do, because I'm like, I'm the Indigenous hub, I can't pitch this. But for instance, like this summer, you know, I was really missing picking up my camera. So I wanted to do a photo essay. So I did a photo essay about the resurgence of drive-in theaters during COVID, you know, as like this really fun kind of summer thing to do. And I thought, like, I can't pitch this. This is not Indigenous related at all. But, you know, they supported me to do that. And I think allowing Indigenous journalists to also reach out of that bubble a little bit into other stories, I think is really important. And I feel like I don't want to talk too much, so I'm gonna pass it on.
That's a great, again, lots of points, and I totally agree with the kind of pigeonholing to journalists. And I saw someone on Twitter tweet this out, you know, that when they got into the industry, they didn't necessarily want to tell Indigenous stories. They wanted to do like pop culture or something like that, but they wound up in a newsroom and found themselves getting pigeonholed, which I guess could be a good thing or a bad thing. So I think that it is really important, especially if there are any employers on joining us today, like to know that to give your reporters a chance to report on non-Indigenous issues too. I think that is super fair. And glad to hear that you got to do that and got to pick up your camera again. Jolene, I know that you're not in one particular newsroom, but you've been in a few, and just wondering if did you feel supported at all when you were starting out I mean, even now, are you getting any support along the way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't been at this role too long in my career, but I feel like I've lucked out with some of the editors that I've had the opportunity to work with, where they've been, you know, really receptive to hearing me out on why I thought things were important. Like if I stressed land and relationships was important in a story, they sort of heard me out for why I needed to include that aspect into my story. And again, encouragement from other editors too, that I don't only have to pitch Indigenous related stories, that I was free to pitch other stories as well. And then I recently lucked out by landing a part-time role with Makwa Creative, which is an Indigenous-led woman media company. And so her role is completely uplifting Indigenous journalists, in particularly women. And so she's going into community, and she's going into like places where maybe mainstream media necessarily wouldn't touch, because like our communities are just so everywhere, right? Like Ontario is humongous, and First Nations communities are so up north and so vast across the province, even across the country. So she's taking the time to hear those stories of like everyday people. And so I feel like I've been pretty lucky, but I think I got lucky after knowing for the longest time, watching and seeing what I didn't like about media. And so now I think, because now I know what I don't like and where I don't want to go, I think I can cherry pick where I want to be, and work with people that I think sort of have an understanding of where I'm coming from and what I'm looking to do.
On that note, kind of on the flip side, I mean, for each of you guys, what do you think the industry can be doing better to support emerging Indigenous journalists? Oscar, we'll start with you.
I think so much of the industry is about networking, right? Who you know, uh, who in the industry that you have connections with. So when I think of that, I think about my own journey into journalism and not seeing a lot of people who look like me in the media world. But I hope just that editors and managing editors, people who really head these news organizations, start making better connections themselves with Indigenous communities. Start learning from the community about who they think are up and coming storytellers and people that they should be involved with. One of the things that I always stress with journalists who want to cover Indigenous communities better is to make friends in community, because you hear a lot of the stories from those people, and you don't always have to stress like, hey, I need a news story. But I think on the flip side too, I'd like to see more people, you know, getting involved with community in a much more meaningful way, making friends, and hopefully you can start bridging that gap on networking opportunities for emerging Indigenous journalists. Um, that's where I see the gaps, because so often the media landscape is shaped by, well, I know my father went to university with this such and such reporter, and I just heard this job opening at this place. So that's kind of how networking has solidified a pipeline for certain people into that. But I don't always see that for Indigenous journalists, and I hope that all of us here can help to network and use our relationships to encourage more emerging Indigenous journalists to take on these roles. Hopefully that wasn't too too.
No, no, thank you. Shelby, same question.
So I think the big issue is hiring more Indigenous people, not just as journalists, but into all different levels. So as editors or producers or CEOs of media companies, because I find as an Indigenous journalist, I was hired for my voice and for my perspective, but then my work is filtered through all these other levels. So even having an Indigenous editor, I think would be amazing. Like I think that they would have that care and that understanding for stories that, non-Indigenous editors might not have, even if they want to, even if they have the best of intentions. And I think another really important thing is training, which JHR does. So you can call them up, because I feel like, as Indigenous employees, I mean, in any field, but in journalism, we have to be the experts. So we have to be teaching people all the time. And that's a lot of energy, away from our actual jobs. And some days you're like, I just want to do my job. I want to write. I want to do, what I'm here to do. And so I think that really taking that responsibility off of your Indigenous employees and taking that into like management's hands to get their employees the access to the training and the resources that they need, I think is really important.
Thank you. Jolene, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that Shelby basically hit every nail on the head. Like I was going to say the exact same thing. It's not just about getting Indigenous reporters onto the field covering the story, because if you don't have the Indigenous producer or the Indigenous editor, then you spend a lot of your time explaining, like I said before, about why it's important to include that relationship. If I wanted to include like an aspect of relationship into the story, someone who doesn't understand Indigenous values and like our 7 grandfather teachings, they're not going to understand why we have this connection to Mother or Earth, or why that's so important to us, or like where we're coming from when we talk about different things like our need to protect water, right? Like one time I did a story on Standing Rock, and I called them land defenders, or I called them defenders. And afterwards I got a scolding saying, no, they're protesters. And I just thought, no, they're not, right? And so then we got into this big debate. But like the producer was saying, this is journalistic standards. Anyone that, like, you know, stands up and protests, like, you have to call them protesters. And I just thought that's not right. And if it was an Indigenous person in that position of power, they would have understood. Like, they would have had a better understanding of why Indigenous people are at Standing Rock, or, you know, opposing pipelines.
Mm-hmm. I think that, yeah, you guys are both right, that it's one thing to, you know, have this kind of push for diversity in the newsroom, but it's another thing if, yeah, you don't have that quote unquote diversity at all levels, including in management, because you're asking so much of young reporters who are just starting out, who are just trying to figure out their place essentially, and, you know, putting all that on them to be explainers and things like that, that it's just, it's not fair. And I don't think that you're going to be setting your reporters up for to be successful. I'm just noticing the time here. This has gone by so quickly. It's been such a lovely conversation with you folks. I'm really glad that we got to do this today. I'm going to end on one last question or note here that is really about, like, why we're here today. So as I understand it, you know, we're talking about this because, or this conversation stemmed out of a letter that Wab Rice wrote, who's a former journalist for CBC for a number of years, and he's an author, very successful author, and he wrote a piece in the Walrus. It's a letter to a young Indigenous journalist about kind of an ode to all of us here. And I think that we have all read it. I am just going to read a portion of it that kind of really resonated with me. And it's towards the end of the letter. There's so many good points in this, but this is kind of what spoke out to me. So he writes, "So speak your truth, be yourself despite the traditional news structures that have long inhibited proper reflection. In the beginning, I was apprehensive to rock the boat because I knew of many trailblazing Indigenous journalists who were chased from the industry just for trying to do what was right. But once I became familiar with the rigid structures of Canadian media and the ways through and around them, I maneuvered myself into a position with significant editorial freedom. I was treated with the respect that I always taught to show others." Which I think is like a very powerful note to end not only the piece on, but maybe this conversation on. You know, like he did talk about a lot of the issues that we're facing in newsrooms, and but I think that it kind of ended on a really uplifting note. And so I guess just for each of you folks, what motivates you to do this work? What was your thoughts on the letter that he wrote, maybe even the passage that I read? We'll start with Oscar.
Yeah, to me, Wob's letter was a very great reminder that you're not tackling all these issues by yourself, that you're not alone in this fight, that there are others who are seeing the same kind of stuff that you see. And as one of the only person of color journalist in my newsroom, that was very affirming. And I thought it was, you know, it's always great to know that you're not the only one that sees it, right? That you're not the only one feeling that weight. And for someone like that to reach out and let you know that there are other Indigenous journalists that, you know, care about you, care about your well-being, it's amazing. And I think he really meant it. I always harken back to just how giving Indigenous journalists have been when it comes to their time and their wisdom and advice. When I first started out, I remember tweeting to Connie Walker and hearing from someone so established like that we need you in these spaces was amazing. And I hope that, at some point, and as my career grows, that I can help encourage other newcomers into journalism like they have. Fundamentally, time. We're always so pressed for time, but when someone like that takes time out of their day to speak so many truths like that, it means a lot, and it was very heartwarming, I think. But yeah, well, on.
Shelby, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think similarly to Oscar, when I read it, I just felt really good that I wasn't alone. I think he mentions throughout the piece, that he recognizes we've probably all thought of leaving this industry because it's so tough. And I think there's been so many times that I've just thought, oh, I'm just not a good journalist. Like, I'm just not good at this job. When really it's, we're pushing up against all these things that we think are wrong and we're trying to change them. And so, I realized that a lot of those things that I thought were wrong in me, I think are wrong in the industry. And I think that the little excerpt that you read, I think he was saying, like, stand up for yourself. And even what Jolene was saying about, journalistic standards and how, they were saying, okay, well, we got to fit this into this mold. And I guess if I could leave like a message for media organizations, it would be to be the leaders in your field. Because I think there's a lot of resistance to change. And I think that this change is coming, whether or not they want to get on board with it. So I think that some of these things really need to be reevaluated, like journalistic standards, like the idea of objectivity, which doesn't exist. I'm just going to say that it does not exist. And so yeah, I think that just, I know change is really slow, but I would just say, like, would you rather be the person who's leading that change, or do you want to be, the one getting dragged along after we've all, made that progress? So that's what I would leave everyone with.
Thank you much. Jolene, we'll end on you, but I'm also we did have some questions coming through, but this sometimes it was hard to fit some points in. But I know one person who's watching asked about if there are alternate options than doing the traditional J school route, getting into journalism, and you didn't go about that route. So I guess you could talk a little bit about the letter, anything that spoke out to you, and maybe like just a little bit about how what opportunities there may be if you're not necessarily going into post-secondary.
Yeah. Well, I think that letter was, I wish I would have heard that letter when I was in mainstream media 14 years ago. But I remember being told, just let the reporters do it. What you're doing on air is just for fun. Just let the reporters do their job. And now, as I'm doing stories, I think, like, that's not true, right? Like, what I'm doing is every bit as important as someone who graduated from J school, because we are the story that we tell. And for far too long, we haven't been able to tell our story in our way. We are storytellers historically from like time immemorial. So I don't necessarily like believe that J school is the only route to go, because I think as long as you tell a story and you tell it truthfully and respectfully, and taking into account, like, all historical factors of it, not just like the main point, but if you look at like the whole story holistically, you're going to get the exact same result, if not a better story. And like I said, we are more than just our pain and trauma. We are living, breathing stories. And so tell a good story. We all have good stories. We all come from community, and there are good stories there to be told.
Well, miigwech to all of you. Like, this has just been a really like affirming conversation for me. I hope that it's been that way for you folks too, and really to hear your perspective. And we're all kind of in different pockets of Turtle Island here, but it's really good to hear that we're kind of all facing the same things or feeling the same things. And I guess just wrapping up, I want to say to any other inspiring journalists out there that it can be quite difficult, but it is so rewarding to be able to share the stories of our people and to connect to land and culture and just be able to explore those stories more in my work as a journalist. And I really, really, urge anyone that has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm really active on Twitter. I try to be as responsive as I can, but I am willing to speak with anyone. And I mean, I'm not going to throw you guys out there too, but I'm sure that that's the case for all you folks as well. Like, reach out, because we want to see more Indigenous journalists out there, and not just Indigenous. I think people of color as well. Like, we need your voices. So on that note, I think it's dependent on where you are and what corner of the world you are, but it's hit the hour mark. So I think that that's good, unless anyone wanted to add anything. But again, like, miigwech, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really fulfilling conversation for me.